Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. Hope you are enjoying your holiday season. If you haven't listened to last year's Christmas episode, we had a great debate on Ebenezer Scrooge. This is not nearly as seasonal. A lot, perhaps a little bit more depressing. But that is an alternative out there if you've not listened to that and you want some really Hallmark Christmas style Radio Rothbard content right there. Instead, we're going to be talking about some stories that may have not gotten proper attention over this past year. Things of great significance that the media, the corporate press, did not want to talk about, was not equipped to talk about, and even more interesting aspects of your Twitter feed might not have touched on it either. And so, joined with his usual holiday spirit, Ryan McMakin. So Ryan, I know this is something that a great topic for Mises.org. I know you've written some articles on it. I know we've had a few other contributors talk about this issue, and that is all of the holiday magic the bureaucrats use to help create job numbers that sound a little bit more pleasing to the ear than might be out there. So can you talk a little bit about the real state of the American employment number, data out there?
Well, it's really remarkable the way the administration continues to talk up jobs as if the employment situation is great in the United States. It is true that most people have jobs, that even by traditional measures, the unemployment rate is probably fairly low. But the fact of the matter is that when you incorporate inflation into the numbers, real wages have been going down for at least 19 months in a row. So people are straight up getting poorer, but we're being told how great the job situation is. And so that seems a little weird. So when we start to delve into the numbers a little bit more, we start to get a little bit suspicious of even the total employment numbers beyond the fact that people's wages are going down. And something that we've been noting more than once at Mises.org is that you have to look beyond the establishment survey. So there's two different surveys that they use to measure employment. There's the household survey, which is where they call people and ask them if they're employed, do they want to be employed, what is their employment status. The other one's the establishment survey, and that's basically just a survey of large employers, and that's a number of jobs that's measured. So it looks at the number of jobs versus the household survey, which is the number of people. And what we found is that for the last really 5 or 6 months, is that the number of employed people hasn't gone anywhere. In fact, it's gone down slightly. And if you compare it to then the establishment survey, which is what everybody quotes in terms of the headline numbers, oh, look, 268,000 jobs were created last month. And it exceeded the estimate, or it slightly missed, or it was beyond our imagination. So many jobs could be created. You have to look at that and you're like, well, how come the number of employed people hasn't changed at all? And when you really start to look at that, what you're realizing is that when you look at the numbers in terms of the number of part-time employment versus full-time, and the fact that people are losing money on their declining real wages, you start to find that there's probably a lot of people then taking on second jobs. Those second jobs, of course, show up in the establishment survey. And you're not necessarily having people from outside the workforce join the workforce. So the job situation is not so great that discouraged workers or people who were driven away from the workforce for some reason, who lost their jobs during the COVID lockdowns, they're not actually coming back. What we find is the number of people not in the workforce has not sizably improved over the last 10 years at all. And so this supposedly red-hot economy is not bringing them back. Moreover, we find that for years, the number of men in the workforce leaving the workforce has continued to decline. So these tight job numbers, we're told there's a $4 million job gap between the number of job openings out there and the number of workers who are available to fill those positions. But when we look, we find that actually there's about more than 6 million, maybe 7 million discouraged male workers. And these are not men who are stay-at-home dads. I would not count a stay-at-home parent among a discouraged worker or someone who has just left the workforce. Those people are, of course, working, right? And they're producing. These are productive people when they're engaged in childcare, especially of their own children. But the number of men, that's less than 250,000 who are totally out of the workforce for reasons of providing childcare. And so what we're left then with is almost 7 million of these people who just disappeared. This is prime age, by the way. You can't say, oh, well, they're retiring. No, we're talking about men aged 25 to 54, and there's millions of them who have disappeared. And the question is, where are they going? Well, those disappeared men who disappear for a variety of reasons, drug addiction, disability, they can just live off of their parents. The marriage rate is way down. So now if you're not married, what's the incentive to work if you can just live at home with your parents? I mean, saying things online from your mom's basement, that's not just like a stereotype. It's like a real thing. Statistics show there's more people doing that. And if the job market was so magnificent, why are so few of those people coming back? So that's a question that needs to be answered, and that's what helps keep the unemployment rate low. And then on top of that, what we find is just the other day, we had new numbers come out from the Philadelphia Fed saying that the Biden administration was wrong by 1.1 million jobs. And so that actually the number of jobs that have been added over the last year is closer to 10,000 rather than 1 million. And so that's just quite remarkable. Now, the numbers that generally come out and hit the headlines, those are the numbers that are rushed into production just a week after the previous month ends. So that's the stuff that the BLS puts out. And they rush in these estimates, and then they say, oh, well, we gained 268,000 jobs based on the establishment survey. Turns out there's much better jobs data, but it's on a much longer lag. So you have to wait months for that data. And that makes sense. That's usually the more accurate data comes from a lag. But what they found is that the number of jobs, even in the establishment survey, that have been added over the last year is barely anything in terms of the total hundreds of the more than 100 million workers that are out there. So looking at that, there is no red hot job market. It's just not there. It never materialized. And so that actually brings home the reality of the household survey, that we're looking at tens of thousands of jobs added in the last year. And then when you look at the number of people who graduated from high school, the number of people who maybe their children aged out and moved out, and so now they're ready to rejoin the workforce because they're 50. Where are they? They can't come back in because it turns out there actually hasn't been that much job growth. And of course, you've seen nothing on that in the mainstream press for the most part. All you hear is how red hot everything is, how great it is, and that it's just fake. It's it's just more fake news coming out of the Washington bureaucracy suggesting that there's just so much job creation. And so that shows us that not only that the White House is parroting wrong numbers, but also that the Fed, at least as it publicly professes, is reading the wrong stuff. So I don't know what the Fed says behind closed doors or what they really think. But I do know that publicly they continue to see that the job market is red hot, that they need to raise rates even more. Now, if you're going to take a totally consequentialist view on that, that's fine, right? If Powell is going to use that strong job number as cover to cut the balance sheet at the Fed and allow interest rates to drift upward, which absolutely needs to happen in order to pop these bubbles, to return the economy to a more normal economy, to get rid of these zombie corporations, then okay, more power to Powell then, I guess. That's assuming he's on my side and that he really wants to actually slay inflation and really tighten up money. I don't know if he wants to really do that or not. And it seems that if they were using these totally anemic job numbers, he would not be able to do that to the same extent because he would face so much pressure over. Everyone would say, hey, look, we've hardly created any jobs in months. the economy stinks. Powell, you have to reverse course. You have to pivot. You have to get the easy money flowing again. There's this fake jobs number out there that Powell's using to keep the interest rate rising. And so just bizarrely, that actually helps us in terms of monetary policy, in terms of correcting monetary policy to where it should be. But at the same time, it's a lie that should be covered, because the reality is that the job market is not actually red hot. And so I'll be interested to see how much longer they can keep that lie going. Is the BLS just going to adjust anything? Are they going to revise things according to the Philly Fed's numbers? How much larger is this gap going to get between the household survey and the establishment survey? I don't know. That's just one of the many weird things that we should be looking for in 2023. But it's a number that it's a phenomenon that has barely been covered at all in the media.
And it's interesting too, because the jobs, this narrative plays into other issues as well. Not only kind of the broader, political football game, but it comes up a lot with the immigration issue, right? I mean, you see there's a lot of big push on the need for, why the border kind of chaos going on right now is actually a good thing, because there's all there's this massive demand for jobs out there that, we have too many jobs that can't be filled, so it plays into the net narrative and right. I mean, it's such a massive disconnect. I mean, it's similar to, I'm reminded of the 2011 to 2014 when talking about the longest. And well, went beyond that even, but the longest economic recovery ever, right? Following 2008, 2009, and like you actually break it down, it was the worst performance coming out of a crisis like that in American history. You had tremendous amount, the real consequences of Obama era regulatory policies hurting small businesses, uncertainty about the political landscape. I mean, I would talk to small business owners here in Bay County, and I mean, they were really concerned about this sort of stuff. And it's continuing now. One topic we're going to talk soon: supply chains. I mean, there's so much. Everyone kind of feels it in their gut that there's something not quite right, and it's difficult to start building up, particularly brick and mortar, things that require significant capital investment that's going to need workers. If you have no idea, if you don't have faith in the direction of the country in the next few years, and it's again the degree to which this jobs narrative is so effectively being parroted out there, it shapes so many different of these news items that the corporate press loves to talk about. So that does bring us to another question. This was a topic that was prominent, for a while in the news cycle, particularly with the very visual issues with the kind of all the cruise line, or all the shipping vessels out in California waiting to get into the ports, empty, big box store shelves, right? But it's the changes in the the continual issues within supply chains. And right now, actually, I'm reading a great book on this topic. James Rickards, who he did several interviews with Jeff Dice in the past. Not an Austrian, but likes to, he likes gold. He was willing to throw in a Mises quote every once in a while. But his book is very fascinating because he talks about kind of the buildup of the complexities of the global supply chain that brought us to, that all kind of came crashing down during COVID and other emergencies. The Ukrainian war is another aspect to it. And I think that, while, there's not so much concerns about, being able to go get toilet paper at Walmart, there is a tremendous amount of the complexities within a lot of the built-in assumptions about supplies and how effortless sort of the incredible globalized economy was, in the pre-COVID days. There are still a lot of issues behind the scenes, ranging from concerns about semiconductors, which plays into global tensions in China, Taiwan issues, and things like that. But you still have all of the misallocation of investments, right? When you had pent up demand from COVID, creating backlogs in certain aspects of the stages of production, right? We are not, again, the idea that we have any sort of vestige of back to pre-COVID normality simply because we don't see the obvious signs of global supply chain shocks. And again, this feeds into larger economic uncertainty out there. And again, for the most part, it's kind of all off the window. It's out the news radar. We talk still about inflation and some of the costs there, perhaps less so with gas prices going down. But the stresses that are still kind of behind the scenes, the problem is, American consumers, and I'm not necessarily picking on Americans per se, but modern consumers, they see the stuff and it comes to your table, and there's no thought about what goes on here, and yet again, some of the difficulties as there's this continuing global resetting, relocating away from China in large portions of different stages of production. And I think you're going to continue to see, when we're kind of dealing with a more a world that's increasingly skeptical of the kind of political norms of the past, where you have, again, I mean, we've seen countries kind of revert back to autarky, right? Particularly in the face of global tensions, countries, prioritize, not wanting to deal with certain agricultural products and things like that. I think that this is a psychological change that countries are, is going to have political ramifications in the future as well. And again, it's so easy, again, to kind of ignore it because we don't see massive ships off the coast of California anymore. There's still a lot of pain. The entire idea that we could turn off and turn back on the economy. There are real consequences to have that within a civilized world. And again, we are seeing it's so easy to take for granted just how complex, again, all of the different aspects of global supply chains really are. When you have to have a massive change of that, like this is a major issue that people still are not. Again, it doesn't have the good visuals anymore, so it gets kind of quickly moved down the news cycle.
Yeah, it's not even really mentioned much by the Fed anymore. Every time the Fed has a press release, they always have an excuse in there for inflation. And for a long time, it was supply chain problem. They always mention the war in Ukraine as a reason for inflation. But you're right. They don't talk about it as much as they do, except maybe in the context of China. But it's interesting to remember just from 2 years ago, we were hearing about just one of the stupidest ideas ever, which is that you can just pause the economy. And we'll just pause the economy and lock everybody down, and that'll solve the COVID problem. And of course, intelligent people were like, you can't just pause the economy and hope everything's fine. But what was especially significant in the case of the supply chain was that they didn't supply the economy, or they didn't pause the economy at all. What they did was they gave a bunch of free money to millions of Americans who then are just buying stuff online, and it's stuff, right? They're just buying huge amounts of stuff because they're not going anywhere. So they're not buying vacations and that sort of thing. And so you have this huge tidal wave then of demand that continues even as the number of people working has gone down. So the productivity was greatly reduced by the lockdowns of logistics workers. And at the same time, though, people have all of this extra money they want to spend on stuff. And so, of course, the narrative was that COVID itself, the disease, is causing all of these problems at the ports and clogging everything up, and the supply chain's a big problem. It was so easy to explain. It was the fact that you reduce worker productivity because you locked a bunch of support staff down, only essential workers were working, and then you gave everybody a bunch of free money. So, of course, you had ships floating out in the harbor waiting to come into port because there was nowhere else they could go. And so the whole narrative on that was completely messed up. And then ever since then, it has never quite returned to normal, again, because you can't just pause the economy. And then things have been made worse by the whole rolling China lockdowns, because that country's completely insane and continues to have, just until recently, lockdowns, shutting down whole cities, including port cities in some cases. So that has really actually dampened demand coming from China. If that returns to normal, you can just expect prices to go up even more, actually, because that's just going to create more demand for oil, for goods, for energy in general, and that'll just further drive up prices. So the whole thing has been really messed up since the spring of 2020, thanks only to government intervention. It would have never risen to the extent that it had without the lockdowns and without all of the quote unquote precautions put in place, in spite of this attempt to just act like this was all just the natural response to a disease, as if it hadn't been forced on people by a bunch of central states. You can just see what's going on in China right now. There's no natural response to the disease there. People are protesting. People's lives are being destroyed by the Chinese state in the name of getting rid of this disease. So there's nothing natural about it. And it's remarkable, though, how, right, where the whole COVID thing is that you're just supposed to forget about the past and just move on, and everything will be fine now, and be nice and forgive everyone who might have done something wrong, because we didn't know it was going to go wrong. And the continuing problem with energy shipments, with all the logistics, it still hasn't gone away. And of course, we have our COVID overlords to thank for that.
And kind of continuing, I think what has been kind of a running theme throughout all of this is that we are still dealing with the political consequences of long COVID, if you will, and again our last item is the degree to which, again, COVID tyranny continues and very much might just be baked into our government systems at this point. And this is true. It's remarkable. It's still within America, like, you can't fly into this country without proof of vaccine. So yeah, not even Canada, I think, still has those sort of tenuous restrictions still in place. But there is continuing drum beats within particularly blue cities and particularly blue cities and blue states about renewed masking policies and things like that. Ryan, being in Colorado, how is, obviously, again, as a Floridian, this stuff really doesn't come up a great deal in conversations, but how are things continuing kind of in your neck of the woods with the conversations of people in your community about COVID? And can you talk a little bit about the political dynamic of that?
Well, the number of people that I see when I leave the house, these are people who are not inclined to wear masks, so I don't hear a lot from them in terms of well, it's time to mask up again, and it's important. People just generally are ignoring it now. But looking at people I don't talk to, just people I encounter in the public, you will occasionally see masks at the supermarket. That seems to be where you see masks most of all, is at the supermarket. So I'm not sure what it is about the supermarket, but you'll still see, a distinct minority, I don't know, 5% of people wearing them there. And of course, you'll see elderly people still wearing them some places, in crowded places. Like I went to 3 different musical concerts downtown Denver over the past month. I went to the Nutcracker. I went to a jazz concert for my son's birthday, and he had a recital. And those were all people packed into rooms. Very little mask wearing, except among the elderly in some cases. And at the jazz concert, where it was mostly young people, there was nothing. And nobody thought about it at all. So that was definitely a change. And I do think that even after getting reelected, Polis is too smart to try that again, just as a politician. So Colorado, that's not going on. It's not like what you're hearing in California, where LA County is really talking up the mask thing again. And I just saw a photo. My uncle sent a picture of himself, and he was wearing a mask. He was at the cemetery where I guess they forced him to wear a mask. So California's a place all of its own. Maybe in New York they're masking up too. So here we are 3 years later, and we're coming up on 3 years. And I mean, just let it go. Of course, I can appreciate it how the administration doesn't want to give up the rights, right? So they continue these lawsuits, the ability to instate mask mandates or the FAA and all that stuff. I totally get why they're doing that, because they don't want to lose the ability to do that, right? They don't want the courts to rule against them and say, you can't do that, because they may want to use that power at some point in the future. Of course they do. They don't want to give up even a tiny ounce of power. But when it comes to other groups just buckling under and saying, "Yep, time to have masks again," especially at the local level or at the state level, it's just quite remarkable the number of people that are going along with it. However, what is being forwarded is that they recognize that COVID isn't enough anymore. So now you're hearing about the twin-demic, where this is a horrible flu year. And so, what's ridiculous is that we're now hearing about how this is the worst flu year in 10 years, as if, all those people who were saying that if you lock people down, that actually makes people more susceptible to other respiratory illnesses. And now, lo and behold, it's the worst flu year ever. And of course, flu affects people, also children and the middle-aged and the productive people, at a far higher rate than COVID ever did. And so now it's at the point where the data, right, there's no easy number you can point to, right? They used to point to COVID cases. Oh, look at how COVID cases are on the rise. Well, those lead to so few deaths anymore that doesn't frighten people. And then you can't point to excess mortality numbers either, because there's no reason to believe that's just COVID driven. Now that we're being told it's the worst year in years for the flu, well, excess mortality might be driven there. Adverse reactions to vaccines. Who knows? It could be any number of things that feed into then these excess mortality numbers. And so it's fortunately the days of, here we have this chart online that we're going to point to, and this proves that people are just dying left and right thanks strictly to COVID. You can't make that case anymore, because there's other illnesses out there that people are dying from, and there's no reason to assume it's COVID. So the convincing nature of that whole sort of propaganda machine they had going, it's just not there anymore. But boy, some of these guys like Gavin Newsom, they just never want to give up on this COVID thing. And I have no doubt that they have diehard supporters who will just continue to freak out about it and think, if Newsom isn't saying something, well, he's just a bad governor, because people need to be aware that there's these diseases out there, and you need to stay at home. You need to wear your mask. You need to get your 5th booster, whatever. And I know from seeing that some people on the left, that if he doesn't say those things, he's actually going to get criticized from the left. Most normal people, though, I just don't think they're paying attention at all anymore, and rightly so.
And this is interesting, because I think there's a dynamic here as well, where, like, historically what the right would do is just kind of want to go away, to the assuming those that don't, aren't on the side of the, public health tyrannical state, right? They just kind of want to go away, and they'd, talk about the lost liberties, whatever. But ultimately, you have to have some sort of counter programming to this. You need a counter narrative. You need to highlight not only does the tyranny and the growth of the state that came from this, recognizing that this is not the normal that we want, but I think the only way to effectively get rid of it is to actually try to put those responsible on the defensive of it. And that's where I think that my obligatory reference to Ron DeSantis, what he's doing right now and trying to hold, you're really trying to make a case for liability. If you're going after the vaccine manufacturers, he's creating kind of a shadow state CDC, if you will, of serious contrarian sort of well-credentialed health experts, the Great Barrington Declaration type of folks. And so he's simply not saying, like, we're back open for business here in Florida. No more. We're never going back to the horrors of 2020. he's trying to leverage his state power to go after those that have benefited from this and help play a role in all this. They have a lot more faith in what DeSantis can do there than any show investigations and hearings. Treating Fauci the same way they treated Hillary Clinton during Benghazi and that sort of stuff. Right? I don't think you're going to get any serious stuff from the federal level in DC Republicans. But maybe there's an opportunity here. If they can actually, because I know that you have liability protections for the vaccine companies regarding Operation Warp Speed and things like that. DeSantis is trying to argue that claims made after that were intentionally misleading and yada yada, and trying to go with that approach. I think the only way you're going to get any sort of reset is doing something beyond going after those responsible in some way, and we'll see if that's successful or not. It is interesting though. One of the last big holdouts of kind of zero COVID as a policy is China, and they have in recent weeks kind of walked back zero COVID in the face of their own protests, which are unprecedented at its scale in the modern era. And now I've been reading some stories about how even within like Chinese social media, which is obviously far more guarded than most, even they're kind of having their same moments of kind of playing clips from Chinese health officials, saying one thing a month ago and now saying, oh, don't worry, everything's perfectly fine now, get back to work. The international ramifications as well. It's going to be interesting to see again how all these tools that they have perfected. The flying drones with QR codes and again all the man-made horrors beyond what we could have hoped, we could have imagined a few years ago. When is the next time these things are deployed? And again, it's inevitable, whether it's the name of climate change or racism or whatever the next boogeyman is. Again, the tyranny, unfortunately, is going to be one of the true things of long COVID out there.
Yeah, get ready for the climate lockdowns. That will probably be a thing in the future. But before we go, I wanted to tack on one last topic on this in terms of topics that really need more attention than they've been getting, and which just basically, I guess we could define as dumb trends in 2022. The other is just the crime. I mean, this has been remarkable in the last couple of years since the lockdowns and with the BLM protests and everything. And that's something where I really hope that 2022 is the end of this trend, because it's remarkable how much it really did go up in 2020 and 2021 and this year. Now, the data is really only partial because remarkably, coincidentally, I don't know, the FBI switched over to a new counting system. And then if you try and go to the FBI's page, they'll tell you, well, we're still collecting the data because the localities haven't responded using the new system and we're lacking data on most major cities and all of that. So we don't actually even have a good nationwide number on homicides yet for 2021 even at this point, because there's usually like a 9-month lag. And so what's that number look like? You have to delve into some of the more local data where you got cities like San Antonio, New York City, Chicago, California cities. They're all looking at multi-decade highs in terms of total homicides and returning swiftly, if the trend continues, back to the horrible days of the early 1990s, the late 70s, and early 80s. That was when you had nationwide homicide rates being around 9 per 100,000, which is really just quite remarkably high. And then it went into steep decline over the last 20 years. It hit basically the lowest since about 1960 in 2014, I believe, when it got down below 5 per 100,000. And then it kind of bottomed out there for a little while. And then it started to inch back up after 2017. But then by 2020, it just was heading up over 5%, 5.5%, 6%. the trend was quickly upward, or not 6%, but 6 per 100,000. And the trend was heading upward quickly and really quite alarming, not just homicide, of course, but other forms of violent crime. And of course, there's endless debate, right? The left wants to tell you that it's guns that make that happen. Of course, that doesn't explain crime not using guns, which is also on the increase. It does explain, of course, homicide in many cases, because most homicides are committed with guns. But why did homicide rates go down throughout most of the 21st century until recently? During all this period, the number of gun sales increased dramatically. So what happened then in 2020? So the right will tell you, oh, it was BLM, it was the anti-police stuff is going soft on police. It's hard to guess. I tend to be partial, as I've written many times on the site, so people who follow me closely probably think I sound like a broken record, but everybody has their own theory about what drives homicides. But I am partial to the theory forwarded by Randolph Roth in his book American Homicide, which is that disorder, political disorder, and a decline in feelings of the state's legitimacy drive up homicide rates. And certainly some of that then would be explained by BLM and the anti-police stuff. But a lot of it would just also be explained generally by people recognizing just how messed up the federal government is, and just how corrupt it is, how much they're being gaslighted. I think there is a real decline in the amount of legitimacy people give to the government, and I think that just then does drive people's willingness to follow the rules, to view themselves as members of a larger community, and that they shouldn't hurt, defraud, kill other people in those communities. That's what Roth attributes those rock bottom homicide rates from the 1950s to. That was an anomaly to have such low homicide rates in those days, 2-3 per 100,000. That's not normal for the United States. The 20s were high. The late 19th century was horrible in terms of violent crime. And so looking at that, that's actually a pretty good phenomenon to explain how that happens, because in the wake of World War II, people really did feel that the U.S. government was wonderful, that it did good things, that we're all Americans and we should all be subject to this stuff. That was a widespread feeling. That's certainly not the feeling you get now. We've talked about that many times on the splits that you're getting now from state to state, and the idea that Americans no longer feel this, or that middle Americans no longer feel the solidarity with New Yorkers, and that if 9/11 were to happen today, you probably wouldn't even have the rallying together phenomenon that you had back then. I think that really does affect violent crime, as if you look at the research, it supports that theory. And how long will that continue? If the economy goes into disarray, I don't think that's going to help a lot. And just if we continue to see that the central government just is lying to you, can manage to deal with the economy, is shipping billions of dollars to Ukraine while the economy worsens here, I think that's just going to further feed violence in the United States. But it's just something that's not being covered. Even though it affects lower income communities the most, the news just hasn't showed a lot of interest in really talking about it. All they can say is, and I've said this too, because this is relevant when crime is heading down, is that it really was quite low, remarkably low, 6 or 7 years ago. And these were lows. And then just as it started to inch up, that wasn't a big deal, especially when you consider the fact that nationwide, right? If you live in the suburbs, you're not going to be a victim of violent crime. This has all been driven by crime in specific places, in specific cities, and specific types of neighborhoods for the most part. And those people are being victimized much more so than normal, and yet you just don't hear about it in the media. So it's remarkable that has been covered so little, and this is a 3-year trend that really deserves more attention and is just not getting that much.
Yeah, the general kind of decivilizing of America, and again, I don't think it's so unique to us, but it's a variety of different forms. It's something that, even friends of mine that are not in the Mises orbit are talking about it now, which is very interesting. And of course, one of the things I fear the most is that the inevitable political response to the crime trend, right, is going to be an increase. And you've already seen this with some of Biden's spending already, an increase in federal funding to local police units. That funding is going to have federal strings attached to it. And so we're going to have kind of the further federal takeover of local policing, which has various ramifications in the long run on how tight they're able to draw those connections. And again, I think it was the old the John Birch Society bumper sticker, like you keep your sheriff local and independent or something like that. And this is precisely the sort of crisis that I think DC will use to make sure that that is less and less accurate. Well, with that being said, hope everyone out there is having a very happy holiday season. Merry Christmas, Ryan, to you and yours. It's been a fun 2022 doing this podcast with you and everything else. So for those tuning in, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.